Sorry, guys. Okay, so next up we have Alexandra Alberda, and she's curator of Indigenous Perspectives at Manchester Museum. Alexandra will be talking about indigenuity and storytelling, pluralizing natural sciences and environmental knowledge. So go ahead, Glenn.
Thank you for coming to this presentation, and we'll get right to it. First, I would like to tell you all a story, how beaver stole fire from the pines, which has been passed down through the Mi'apu people in Idaho. Once, before there were any people in the world, the different animals and trees lived and moved about and talked together, just like human beings. At this time, the pine trees had the secret of fire and guarded it jealously from the rest of the world, so that, no matter how cold it was, no one could get fire to warm themselves by, unless he was a pine. At length, an unusual cold season came, and all the animals were in danger of freezing to death because they could get no fire. But all plans to find their secret from the pines were in vain, until Beaver hit upon one which proved successful. At a certain place in the Grand Rand River in Idaho, the pines were about to hold a great council. They built a large fire to warm themselves by after coming out of the icy water from bathing, and had posted sentinels around to keep off all animals and other intruders who might steal their fire secret. But Beaver had hidden under the bank near the fire before the sentinels had been posted, and so escaped their notice. After a while, a live coal rolled down the bank close by Beaver, which he seized and hid in his breast, and then ran away as fast as he could. The pines immediately raised the hue and cry and started after him. Wherever he was hard pressed, Beaver darted from side to side and dodged his pursuers, and when he had a good start, he kept a straight course. Hence the Grand Rand River is very tortuous in places and straight for some distance, because it preserves the course of Beaver. After running a long time, the pines grew tired and decided to abandon the chase, so most of them halted in a body on the river bank, where they remain in great numbers to this day and form a growth so dense that hunters can hardly get through it. A few, however, kept on after beaver, but they finally gave out one after another, and they also remained scattered at intervals along the banks of the river in the places they stopped. There was one cedar running with the foremost pines, and although he despaired of capturing beaver, he said to a few pines still in the chase, "Although we cannot catch beaver, I will keep on to the top of the hill yonder and see how far ahead he is." So he ran to the top of the hill and saw beaver far ahead, just diving into the Big Snake River, where the Grand Rand enters it, so that further pursuit was out of question. He saw beaver dart across the Big Snake River and give fire to some of the willows on the opposite bank, and recross farther on and give fire to the birches, and so on to other kinds of wood. Since then, all who have wanted fire have got it from these particular woods, because they have fire in them, and give it up more readily than other kinds when rubbed together in the ancient way. Cedar still stands all alone on the very top of the hill where he stopped after the chase of beaver, near the junction of the Grand Rand River and the Big Snake. He is very old, so old that his top is dead, but he still stands as proof to the truth of the story. That the chase was a very long one is shown by there being no cedars within 100 miles upstream from where he stands. The old people point him out to the children as they pass by and say, "See, there is old Cedar standing in the very spot where he stopped chasing beaver." So the story you have just heard is a part of the Talking Stories project. And the method that they used as part of this project, which you'll see on the screen from Vine Deloria Jr., is that they used published accounts of research that was already conducted with Indigenous peoples. But what this project does that is different is that it brings it together with traditional ecological knowledge and pulls out those themes. So you'll see listed zoology, botany, cultural and physical geography, as well as technology. And then also then sections on culture, maps of where this takes place, and the references where these stories come from and where the understanding of the traditional ecological knowledge comes from. So this project is something very interesting that we might look at and model ourselves under, that brings these different things together and shows these different sciences, because that story was full of science. It just might not be what the universality of Western science sees as science, but it's starting to reach through and connecting it to traditional ecological knowledge and also newer understandings of science in a polycultural approach. Now, before we get into big themes of Indigenous cultures, which I will do, I want to tell you one more story about beaver. That story is about the Eurasian beaver that once had lived in the United Kingdom, but then in the 16th century became extinct from hunting and also just treating them like rodents. So you have a different story of beaver if we're looking within the United Kingdom. And so this is the information you would get if you went into our collections as a member of the public and just looking up beaver, wanting to know about beaver. So you hear the story of extinction, you hear the story of reintroduction, and you can find out more information on the reintroduction of beaver as well, which I'll dip into. But you also hear how just hints of the amazing lives they lived and what they contributed. So the reintroduction and the story I would tell you that I can find about beaver in the UK is the current one of reintroduction into different areas. And when you read these stories, there's really good information on the RSPB website about how the different areas, so in Scotland, England, and Wales, how the reintroduction is going on, and what benefit beavers are and why the decision was made to try to reintroduce them into the area. And so you get something that I think is really positive in this story. So beaver's gift of fire. So that I'm going to go into some key themes that are in here within this story that I think is really important. And it's a point where we can all meet and bring our different ideas of science, our different methods and beliefs, and create that polycultural approach that Kimmerer talks about. But one thing that I think we need to return to with the first story, the Nimiapu story that they've passed down on beaver, is that beaver in these areas, although sometimes is an antagonist in stories, is often that very trustworthy, hardworking figure that works for everyone, and people go, and when I say people, that can be animal people, plant people, human people, can go to. And so in here, we see a story of beaver. Beaver doesn't just get fire for other beavers, right? Beaver passes on fire to the different woods so that they can give it up readily so that the plants and animals that weren't pine could survive this winter, this kind of devastation that was going through nature, if you see where I'm going with this metaphor. But so beaver decides to do that, and then the story also passes on through its technology in that traditional way of rubbing sticks together to create friction, to create fire, tells of which wood will more readily give that up. So that's knowledge that beaver has given, passed down. Fire is a major part of celebration and ceremony within these people as well. And so when we're looking at fire, fire is connected to rebirth. It is connected to new ideas and new concepts. And so fire is knowledge. Fire is passed on. And so what beaver gifts us as the hardworking figure that works for his entire ecosystem, within this story at least, is that knowledge that we need for survival, and something that is shared. It doesn't contain within certain species, but it's something that the different peoples, again, animal, plant, human, that can possibly come together. And so that's kind of the metaphor I want to keep us in, and what we might learn from beaver in the Nimiapu story, but then how about our own story of reintroduction through the RSPB, specifically that kind of narrative that we even saw in the Manchester Museum's collection. So in bringing these together, I think there's some key terms that from Indigenous cultures and in contemporary Indigenous scholarship that we can think about. And so one of those is traditional ecological knowledge, which was in that story that I told you, it's accumulated through time. Don't get tricked by that traditional. The traditional is so much a part of the adaptive processes that are always evolving, and it's about cultural transmission. It includes ecology, spirituality, human and animal relationships. So it's a very holistic approach, but it's contemporary as well. And so we see that too in how it plays out in indigenuity, which is earth-based deep spatial knowledge that really works from this traditional ecological knowledge that's been passed down and doesn't dismiss it for this new Western science, but brings these together. So indigenuity is contemporary, it's everyday. People are doing it right now, and they're blending these different cultures and these different sciences and technologies together to find solutions. And so I think we can even model that in the types of stories we tell and how we bring these different cultures together. And there's not one's better than the other, but this is very much a shared coming together. And so we also see that in the cultural side. So those were indigenous approaches to science that we just heard and terms in there. But then when we go into the culture, because it is a holistic science, we can see things like 7 generations thinking. So 7 generations thinking, it depends on where in the world you are. Sometimes you're thinking 6 generations ahead of you in the future, and that's how you make your decisions. And sometimes you're being influenced by 3 generations of the past. You're in the middle to make your decisions to benefit generations 3 times ahead of you. So there's this idea that it's not about the immediate when you're making these decisions, but you're also thinking about the future. But also there's cultures of gratitude and reciprocity. So in that, there's as humans, we're given a gift, and our gift is gratitude. That's what we have. And the most powerful part about our gift, whereas like rain has other gifts, different animals have different gifts, but our power of gratitude starts the cycle of reciprocity. And so what we can do is show gratitude to beaver, to nature, and start that process of reciprocity. And the other players are not just other humans, even though that is one thing across cultures, but they're also the animals. They're also the plants. So it's being grateful for what they provide, learning from them, and playing our part in sustaining life. So in all these things, and I know that was very brief, but it was very important that we sit with these stories and we sit with complexity and a different approach when thinking about how we might approach stories of environmental breakdown and harmony. And I think Beaver's story is one where we can show how important Beaver was in this time before time, or in our stories when we had a more harmonious relationship and it wasn't as hierarchical, and other cultures, and then maybe trying to find our own. But then also when we incorporate it into these Western sciences. And so bringing these together, I think we come together and we find some really interesting things. And I think the stories that we can tell can elicit that awe and wonder. Beaver just doesn't get lost into the many, many, many stories of reintroduction and rewilding, but Beaver kind of sits out, and we see the gift that specifically was given to Beaver to be a part of that cycle of reciprocity, and that cycle that is so important to ecosystems that we've broken apart as human beings by stepping outside of that. But there's all other benefits to these types of stories that I think we can encourage and we can introduce, like you'll see here on the slide. And I won't go into each of one of those right now because I'm running out of time, but we can see where there's so much potential for bringing in new angles to this idea. And I think one of the most important things I will talk on is we can't just tell the devastation, but I think this is an interesting way that we're all kind of grappling with. How do we also tell positives, or a way that helps us actually action this and be a part of change that isn't so overwhelming? And I think different approaches to storytelling is one way of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. A fantastic thoughtful, inspiring talk to finish on for the end of the talks today. I have a couple of questions of my own, and we've just had a couple come through as well. So Sean Tudor is saying, when you are sharing the knowledge from Indigenous peoples, how is the museum navigating the space of holding, storing and sharing information that does not belong to it and may not be allowed to share? He says, yeah.
Yeah, so that's, I think there's two different ways of doing that. So I think the most important way going forward is to start these conversations with communities, and to reach out to people. So if there's a certain story you want to tell, or a certain collection you're looking at maybe doing this with, and in a concentrated way, is just seeing the people related to it and reaching out. Most Indigenous communities have their own art centers, they have community centers, they even have their own museums themselves, and they've had to negotiate their cultures on what they're willing to share and do that. So this is like not new business to them. So I think that is the number one, is always reaching out to people, because they have internet, we have internet, let's send an email. And you can always kind of reach out to community as well within that space, because it might be that tribal government is very different from the elders and the leaders, and they might have competing interests within that, just as we do in any community and group of people. But specifically with the story that I told and shared, that one follows Divine Deloria Jr.'s process of that I talked about, with if it's already printed, and especially if you can figure out, so the link I shared in the chat, if you go to the bottom, it shows the references where they found those materials. So you can even look into how the research was done to try to determine if an ethical process was given, and if the elders gave informed consent when telling those stories. And some of those kind of researchers will talk about historically how they knew some things were withheld, and these were the things willing to share. But it's best to reach out to people directly if you can, because my own people don't believe in writing down culture, because then it's dead. If you have to go to a book to celebrate your culture, it's not living, it's not in community. But other groups are all about that sharing, and they want that, because then like especially the gifts of Thanksgiving, the point is to share it around the world, and we all have this. So it's always important to reach out to people when you can.
Great, thank you. I actually have a question coming from Wales. We've got our own kind of culture within Wales, and our own folklore and history and stories, and it's the same for England and Scotland and all of the nations within the UK. And I was wondering if you've been looking to those cultures and communities to engage with kind of more kind of UK based, if you want to call it that, folklore, to help talk about nature and things like that.
Yeah, and so that's definitely something I want to do, and not with beaver, because that was something I kind of wanted to bring here, to also learn about a different ancestor than what I'm used to. But I am working on a project called Cooking and Collections, which will bring a story of wajopi, which is a Lakota recipe, using almost like a berry preserve that's eaten on ice cream. I like it on fry bread because I'm not healthy, but you can also just eat it on other healthy things too, I'm sure. But in bringing that here, I also want to meet with locals who make blackberry jams. The whole point is picking that recipe is that there's blackberries all over, and we have all this rich history here of picking it, preserving it, and there's like a blackberry foraging community. There's like elderly communities that make jam and things like that. So in bringing those together, so I definitely am in other areas, is where do we have related stories, and actually when we get to that like folklore and stuff, we have a lot of commonalities. We have differences, of course, but there's some common stuff there, and I think that is a place where we meet and where we can celebrate both difference and coming together in a way that doesn't have that quite, but they're different and I don't quite understand them. And who doesn't love food?
Absolutely.
Where we actually get brought together on a table.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking of it being a way that different communities can yeah, kind of bond together wherever you're from or wherever you are in the world. I just have one last question. So we've got 3 minutes left of the sessions. I really wanted to get this one in because it's something we've been really grappling with as part of the decolonising process. How you give equal merit to alternative perspectives and narratives, i.e. above and beyond hard science. So how you I guess balance it. So as a scientist, we obviously come from a scientific perspective. So when we're talking to visitors, you know, how we put those perspectives forward. So just a couple of minutes for that.
Yeah, I think, and so that one's all about institutional change. And I would say from the beginning, as you're stepping forward into it, don't expect you're going to get it right the first time. And in fact, it's something you need to stumble through, because then you're being more critical and aware. I find one of the biggest things is the lack of different participants. I think one way is to be relationship focused versus object focused, and to bring in different collaborators to help you build that when you can. So if you brought in an Indigenous person and you have a close relationship, and a relationship that's very open to critique and reciprocity, so learning from each other, I think that's a great way of bringing that together, because they might point out, if you have a good relationship, like, ooh, the thing you're saying right there kind of sounds like my myths are fake, or they're not as real. But it is then also down to that linguistic level. So when you're with visitors and you're telling these stories, do you then say, oh, and here's a myth. Here's a fake story in history when they used to believe that beavers could talk. You know, it's going over that and almost assuming, like I did in this presentation, is I kind of went, I'm just gonna assume we all agree that that first story is a legit science, that we've all been trained in it, and just present it that way, and not always try to make it about that debate of whether or not it is legit, and to move past that to the action of saying, it does have value, it brings forward a new perspective with these different benefits. And that's something we do in humanities too. So that is not just a science thing, it is the decolonization 101, is how do we get past that debate that it's something we have to do, or it's something that relates to these things, but getting to the action, getting to rewriting. But it's just, it's so much about having these relationships and talking with different people.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. That's so interesting. Both really interesting talks, and thank you both for being here today. I'm not sure if you're staying on for the Q&A session. Lovely. Okay, so the Q&A session actually starts now. So Isla will be chairing that. Thank you to both of the speakers today. And I will hand over to Isla, I think. I'm not sure.